So given that we're all here at the Greenheart Transforms conference, I bet that we're all conscious of what we eat, where it comes from, how it was grown. We buy organic when we can, and some of us even grow our own food. We make sure that we have a connection to what we eat, that it aligns with our values in a holistic way. In fact, today, we're hearing from some amazing leaders in the food movement. We've come so far in the last 20 years in how we as consumers and growers think about food. We've worked hard to use our food systems to change unhealthy patterns and to restore our connection to food and to the land. But what about our clothing? Does our clothing align with our values? Are we connected to the process? Do we know where it came from, how it was made, and who made it? Does it say something about who we truly are as people, or is it an afterthought, or even consumptive entertainment? The question I pose today is, what if we could have the same conscious connection to our clothing as we do to our food? Well, there was a time when we did. As our previous presenters have already mentioned, the connection between the food culture goes back to the cradle of civilization, and the connection between our food and clothing is back there. Anywhere you find a society that's involved in agriculture, you find weaving. And before there was polyester, we got our fibers exclusively from the crops and livestock that we raised. We harvested, carded, spun, wove it, knit it, cut it, and sewed it. Go back a few generations in any of our families, and you'll most likely find a farmer and a stitcher. My own family is no different. My great-grandmother was a farmer in Kansas until the Depression pushed her off her land, and then she moved to St. Louis and used her dressmaking talents to support the family. But then fast forward to my grandmother and mother's generation. Both were taught to sew, but hardly did. They were both working women, a secretary and a teacher respectively, and associated home sewing with times when they lacked the money to buy ready-made clothing from a department store. They were adjusting to changes in society, balancing caring for children with full-time work. Why make when you could buy the latest fashions? Who had time to make things anyway? Besides, store-bought was considered better than homemade. This was a time of huge changes in society, an era fascinated with technological advances and efficiency of canned and frozen food, TV and TV dinners, the beginnings of passive consumption. But pre-NAFTA, our clothing was still very expensive. Most of us only had the funds to purchase a few new items per season. Trends moved slowly. Most people still had a make-do and mend mentality and a working knowledge of sewing. No one would think of throwing out a garment because it was missing a button or because they had lost or gained a few pounds. They would repair it themselves or take it to a local tailor. We valued our clothing, both because most of us had at least a sense of how incredibly labor-intensive that process is, and also because clothing was not cheap. In 1950, for example, the average American devoted over 10% of their income to clothing, as compared to less than 3% nowadays. And yet, back then, most people owned a few pairs of shoes and a handful of outfits, whereas now most of us own more clothing than we could ever possibly wear out. Fast forward to a post-NAFTA world where most of us toil long hours, but we can't get ahead financially. Companies like Walmart have entered the clothing market and often order upward of 500,000 pieces at a time of a single design. Fast fashion companies like Zara and H&M are releasing new collections twice a week or over 100 collections per year, and the cost of a t-shirt is often less than the cost of a latte. The market is now split between conspicuous consumption of designer branded apparel on one end and disposable fashion on the other, with little in the center. So why is all of this important? What are the consequences of the garment industry as it currently stands? Well, first of all, we have the issue of tons of waste. Every year, Americans throw away 12.7 million tons of textiles. That equals 68 pounds per person per year. And yes, a portion of that can and should be recycled. But right now, as it stands, many textiles are not designed with a cradle-to-cradle process in mind. For example, blended fibers, which are especially popular in the high-volume fast fashion world. So we're still lacking in technologies that can efficiently separate out blended fibers in order to be recycled. And yes, some of these discarded textiles could be donated to thrift stores. And that's a great thing. But charities like Salvation Army are already flooded with more donations than they could ever possibly handle. So what they do with the excess is they send some of it to be made into rags and industrial textiles. And the rest of it is sold to consolidators that ironically sell it back to the developing countries where this clothing was made in the first place. And in fact, used clothing is now one of the top US exports by volume, which again is ironic because we didn't make it in the first place. So we just use it for a minute and then send it back where it came from. And then what's left over, what's in too poor a shape or where there's too much of just goes into a landfill. Second, we have the issue of oil and plastics. Polyester, acrylic, and nylon are all plastic-based and thus oil-dependent. And the production of man-made fibers has almost doubled in the past 15 years with the rise of fast fashion and post-NAFTA. So polyester now accounts for more than 40% of all the fiber produced in the world. That's 50 billion pounds per year. And over half of that is produced in China, where environmental regulations are sorely lacking. Next, making textiles in general is an incredibly water and electricity intensive process, not to mention often highly toxic. Both the pesticides that are used to grow natural fibers, but also the dyes that are used to color yarn and fabric. US environmental regulations have evolved greatly so that now US-based textile mills can no longer dump toxins into our water and soil, but partly as a result of these regulations, the textile industry has simply offshored production to countries that lack the environmental regulations necessary to reduce the impact of the fiber making process. There are ditches and rivers in Bangladesh that run red or fuchsia or turquoise, whatever today's trendy color may be. These are the same rivers from which workers and residents who live near the factories get their drinking water. But closer to home, the current structure of the garment industry has resulted in the loss of jobs. The US now makes only 2% of the clothing that we buy. That's down from 50% in 1990 and over 90% in the middle of the 20th century. The loss of unionized manufacturing jobs has contributed to the rise of unemployment, the decline of domestic wages, and the hollowing out of the middle class. And who have these workers lost their jobs to? Well, workers in developing countries are often workers who are being pushed off their land, who were formerly farmers, by the changes in the agricultural process, the rise of agribusiness. They're often rural folks from minority population, often young girls, 13 to 14 years old. They come into the city to work 80 to 100 hours a week, live 6 or 8 to a room, and send what they can of their wages back to their home villages. But they're not making a living wage, even to support one person. And yet, on average, their earnings total a mere 1% of the retail price of the clothing that they produce. They are the rock bottom of the labor market. And the conditions that they toil in are terrible. 2013 was the deadliest year on record for garment workers. Several hundred died in large separate fires in Bangladesh and Pakistan where exits were blocked, so workers couldn't leave the building once the fire had started. And then also the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh in April of 2013, and it was a preventable accident. People saw cracks in the foundation, but the companies thought, nope, Walmart, Gap, they need to get their orders, you gotta go in there, you're gonna lose your jobs. And so over 1,000 people died and several hundred more were injured. But in the face of all this gloom and doom, there is hope. This is not the Greenheart Depresses Festival. This is Greenheart Transforms. We can and are making change, just like we have in the food movement. So some of the solutions are simple and quick, and some are difficult and will take a longer view. But I think it all starts with finding a connection to our clothing. These aren't frivolous matters. For millennia, clothing was a conscious expression of who we are as people and as a culture. Going back to that word, our theme today. It still is, but the system of rampant capitalism in which we live has largely obfuscated our connection to one another, to our core selves, and to the process of how things are made. We're often passively consuming what we're told is the next big trend, or just buying the cheapest thing available to be done with the whole thing. But we can't just drop out and expect the fashion industry to change. So here's what we can do. First, I'm going to start with big picture stuff. So we can tune in, we can open our eyes, and we can educate ourselves. We can find our values and begin to live them. For me, the process went like this. For many years, I worked in the fashion industry just trying to design products that would sell well and keep me and my friends in a job. But after a while, I stopped feeling connected to the product or to the consumer. I knew that I worked in an industry where most workers were being exploited. I even saw some of it firsthand when I visited potential contractors and I was asking tentative questions of suppliers. But mostly, I pushed down these nagging questions because I feared what the answers would yield. I tried to fill the void by buying things, going out, distracting myself, and eventually I was at least able to face my dissatisfaction and admit that I was lost. So I quit my job and I left the industry. I went to graduate school, and as Andrea mentioned, I got a degree in social work, and I focused my studies on labor rights, specifically in the garment industry, since that was an area that I knew. I worked as a labor organizer for several years at a worker center called Arise Chicago, which was a wonderfully transformative experience and consciousness raising. But I realized that I missed making things. I missed working with my hands. I missed fabric, color, and texture, the process that I was very passionate about. And that now I had the tools and information that I needed to make my work fulfilling and to begin to live my ethics. And so I began to do the freelance work with fair trade organizations and ethical brands. I had the opportunity to work in China with a group called Threads of Yunnan, and in Lima with a group called Intercrafts Peru. In addition, I began to make custom made-to-measure clothing, and I realized that the custom process is a great way to connect consumers to their clothing because they're involved in the process and because the piece is tailored specifically to their bodies and their lifestyles. And so it's more valued and appreciated. It's not something someone's just going to throw out. Similarly, I began to make artwork about the social meaning of fashion. I collaborated with people in my community to custom make their ideal uniform. And I had each participant write an essay about what they chose and why they chose it, what the piece meant to them. Much of the work called into question the intersection of identity, gender, class, occupation, and the ways that clothing can reinforce, subvert, or supersede these expectations. And here are some images of that work. I found uniforms to be a compelling subject because they often are used to either classify, identify, segregate, or control groups of people. But conversely, they can also be used to erase differences and equalize individuals. Then there's also a great tradition of activists and artists who appropriate and subvert the institutional symbol of the uniform and the conformity, control, and power that it can represent. Finally, beyond the idea of traditional codified uniforms, most occupations and subcultures have an informal, unspoken uniform, and so consciously bringing those codes and rules into view was also of interest to me, and on a deeper level allowed me to step out of the trend-driven fashion system. So next, I wanted to be sure that activism and organizing remained a part of my life and work. And I think it's really important to have that social action part and then that personal development part. And the small picture and the big picture, and where those things meet really is the core of our power and sustains us. So I joined Chicago Fair Trade, and I helped to lead the campaign that Andrea mentioned to pass an ordinance in the city of Chicago, ensuring that our tax dollars do not fund sweatshops. So the ordinance was successfully passed this summer, and starting this next year, our city's multi-million-dollar uniform contracts must go to ethical contractors. And I'll be part of a monitoring group to make sure that the ordinance will be implemented properly, so that'll be another challenge and learning experience. Currently, I'm developing my own clothing line called Production Mode that will launch in January. For each Production Mode launch, I'll collaborate with a different artist to produce a limited edition collection. So the first launch, for example, artist Paula Wilson designed a screen print for leather. And this is a good segue because that's her right there. So we collaborated on a uniform and then moved on into this screen print project. So the leather is from a local Chicago tannery that's staffed by a unionized workforce. It's called Horween. It's on Armitage and Elston. So I've been there many times. You all can visit. And they're very supportive of small designers like myself. Oh, so here's a picture of that screen print, which is not showing up great in this giant screen. But here's Paula working on it. The leather is vegetable tanned, which is a natural, slow process to soften and finish the hides using plant matter. And this is in contrast to most modern leather production, which uses a chrome tanning process that's very quick, but can cause carcinogenic chromium to develop in water supplies when not properly disposed of. Then the hides, I'm having hand screen printed by a local artist named Nora Rennick Reinhardt. Oh, somehow that slide is missing. But she does exist. She's a real person. She has a name. You can visit her at Little Street Art Center. And they'll be cut in the US using an automated digital cutter, which uses technology to ensure that leather is cut with as little waste as possible. And then they'll be sewn to order in my shop by a garment worker who is hired through the Catholic Charities Refugee Resettlement Program and who earns a living wage. And here are a couple of photos from the line. Oh, one of them also got lost, but here, I'll just leave that one up there for you. The rest is still in process and has not yet been photographed. So stepping out of the traditional fashion system was terrifying and continues to be terrifying as I pour my heart and soul and money into building this business. But I'm a lot more fulfilled knowing that I'm working towards a sustainable, meaningful vision of what fashion can be. I know that at this amazing event and with this fantastic community here that I'm preaching to the choir. But I do think that those of us who are in tune with the issues of labor and sustainability need to spread the word that fulfillment comes when we face our problems and take responsibility for our role in creating those problems, and in turn realize the potential that we have to solve them. Sure, maybe we get involved with social justice work because of a nagging in our conscience, but I think that it's important to focus on the fact that when we listen to that call, our lives, our work, our relationships, and our sense of connectivity and humanity actually improve and become deeper and more meaningful. So, as Ken mentioned, we get back much more than we put in. But in addition to that big picture and foundational perspective, I also want to cite some small steps that we can take as consumers of clothing in order to support slow fashion and change the garment industry for the better. So some more concrete stuff. First of all, we need to buy less. We need to buy higher quality, and we need to take care of what we have. That also means educating ourselves on what quality is. We've become so divorced from the process of making things that often we have no sense of how it's done. Making things is such a joy, and it's a fallacy that artists are somehow special creatures. All humans are creative, and we all derive pleasures from making things, whether it's kimchi or a purse or growing our own vegetables, so we should all be involved in that process. So I encourage everyone to take a sewing class or to learn some kind of craft or to garden, to use their hands. While we might not become experts in any of these processes, it's easy enough to learn how to perform simple repairs and alteration of our clothing, or at least to garner a connection to and an appreciation of the process, and to learn how to identify quality goods, quality food. Second, we need to ask questions. Where are our clothes made? By whom? How are the workers paid? Do they work in safe conditions? If a brand isn't telling you what factory makes their clothing, or if they're blaming their contractors for the bad treatment of workers or problems of health and safety, then that's not a good sign. Chances are they're either burying their heads in the sand or they have something to hide. They may cite trade secrets, but that's very silly. We need to demand that brands take responsibility for their supply chain and demand transparency in those supply chains. If your favorite brands aren't doing so, write them and complain so that they know that these issues are important to their customers. In addition, buy from fair trade and ethical manufacturers. Get to know your local designers. There are so many fairs and events right now that highlight local design. Attend those events and get to know the people who make your clothing, similar to how you get to know your local farmers at local farmer markets. And hold us accountable. Next, besides making our own individual purchases count, let's think about our collective power in the form of our tax dollars, our school tuitions, our charitable donations, and our religious offerings. These institutions, our governments, our schools, our charities, our places of worship should be upholding our values. We need to make sure that the purchases that these large institutions make are not funding sweatshops. And we can use these larger scale contracts to affect change in the garment industry and beyond. Similarly, we can join and support advocacy groups like Chicago Fair Trade that support ethical manufacturers and retailers, and that organize protests when brands blatantly ignore the health and safety of workers. So our clothing matters. Clothing is the second largest consumer sector after food. It's also where we find the problems of offshoring, rampant consumerism, needless waste, and the very bottom of the labor market. So these are the problems of our current capitalist system, right here. Our purchases can be passive consumption, consumptive entertainment, or an expression of our values. I vote that we take a cue from our collective work in the food movement and create and wear clothing that is sustainable in the largest sense of the word. Clothing that supports our values and ethics, that is well-made and long-lasting, and that creates good jobs and supports the planet and the people on it. And that'll go a long way to giving us the tools that we need to solve the problems inherent in our current economic system. Thank you.